2022. That really has been the year on everybody's lips for the past 18 months now, as we all hope, speculate, and for some of us pray that the Mercedes reign of domination will end the next season. But with that said, there is one thing going into next year that we've been talking about for longer than 18 months, arguably for 4 or 5 seasons, and that is Valtteri Bottas and how long he could be able to hang on to that seat at Mercedes. I'm Jaden, welcome to the channel, and let's get into it. Today we're going to be discussing how much of a chance Valtteri Bottas has at keeping that seat, and perhaps more importantly, if it is worth Mercedes keeping Bottas going forward. Now, I think one thing that we should all note is that over the past maybe 2 or 3 races, frankly over the past season in 2021, I think we've seen a pretty interesting shift in the way that fans perceive Bottas. Beforehand, it was a bit more of a, he's just a wingman, he's just Hamilton's pet, that kind of thing. And I'd say it was generally a pretty hostile kind of public perception towards Valtteri Bottas. But recently we've seen that kind of shift, and we've seen a lot more people start to defend Valtteri for a number of reasons. One of those reasons, of course, is that people ultimately feel as though Mercedes have kind of impeded his progress at the team and have kept him as a number 2. Now, I will say this. I think that to some degree it is true Mercedes want him as a number 2. When they signed him in 2016, nobody thought or expected that he'd really beat Hamilton because he's always been a decent driver, but he's never really been a top-tier elite driver. So we've always kind of had the expectation at Mercedes that he'd always back up Hamilton. And some of you might be thinking, well, that isn't really Valtteri's fault. And no, it's not. It's not his fault that he's not on Hamilton's level, because frankly, most drivers aren't. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that Bottas was never intended to beat Lewis Hamilton. But as a racing driver, of course, he believes and he wants to beat Lewis. But frankly, that hasn't really come into practice. 2017, ironically, his first year at the team was his best, where he finished only 50 points behind Hamilton in the standings, which for his first year at Mercedes, especially when you consider that he had a retirement that year, which Hamilton didn't, it's a pretty solid year. But then things kind of went from bad to worse for him. In 2018, he had 0 race wins, and even if you give him that race at Russia where he was told to let Hamilton by, and where he did let Hamilton by, he would have still been over 100 points behind Lewis. So I think we can all agree that it's been a pretty rough patch for Valtteri. Last season as well, he finished behind Verstappen in the standings, and whilst he was unlucky at races like, whilst he was in some races last season unlucky with things like reliability, whether it's at Silverstone with a puncture, etc., etc., there were many races where his pace just wasn't there. Monza last year, he couldn't overtake anybody. Turkey last year, we all know what happened there. He's had a pretty bumpy ride recently. And I think most people have kind of accepted that it's his time to move on from Mercedes, in place for the younger, and who many believe to be faster, George Russell. Now, I think it's worth giving a kind of more, I would say, unique and intentional look at George Russell. Because I think it's important that we don't just say George Russell is going to be faster than Bottas. Because whilst that's true, we have to really investigate why and how. Because Valtteri Bottas is actually a very, very quick driver. Most people don't give him credit for this, though I think recently more people are. But he's actually a pretty decent driver, especially in qualifying. His one-lap pace is very, very strong. For the past 4 or 5 years, consistently, he's been keeping Hamilton honest in qualifying. But with that said, the one weakness that Valtteri Bottas has, which George Russell doesn't have, for me, is the intangibles. Things like driving ability in the wet, overtaking, consistency, and aggression. Those are all things that Bottas hasn't shown, which Russell already has. And I think one of the biggest things for me, which kind of differentiates Russell and Bottas, is that Bottas doesn't seem that hungry or driven to make improvements to actually beat Hamilton. Granted, on team radio recently, we have seen him be a bit more vocal, such as in the French Grand Prix. And in general, we have seen Valtteri kind of become a bit more outspoken in the media. But ultimately, he doesn't seem to have made the steps that you'd expect him to make to beat Hamilton, because frankly, he's gotten further and further behind. And I hear what you're saying. At races like Monaco this year, where he had a historically terrible pit stop, you can't really blame him for that. That's just kind of bad luck. But we also saw him at Imola struggle for... But we also saw him at Imola struggle for pace, where George Russell in a Williams was faster than him. We also saw him at Baku, way off Hamilton. And whilst, of course, that isn't entirely his fault, because even Hamilton at Monaco was half a second off Valtteri, so without doubt Mercedes had some issues with the car that they couldn't really grasp, it goes without saying that Valtteri hasn't really shown the right stuff, in my opinion, Toronto Mercedes seat. And I think the biggest reason going forward that we can expect and that George Russell should make the leap and replace Valtteri Bottas at Mercedes next season is the fact that F1 is changing, i.e. it's becoming more competitive. This season already we've seen Red Bull, for the first time really since 2013, since the good old Mark Webber and Seb Vettel days, we're seeing Red Bull now fighting and frankly pushing Mercedes enough that many of us now think that Verstappen could win the title this year. And it's not just about Verstappen Hamilton, but it's about Verstappen Perez versus Hamilton Bottas. And Perez so far has shown that he is probably a better driver than Bottas. Now, as I said before, in qualifying, Bottas is a great driver. And even in the race last weekend at France, Bottas had a very good pace. But ultimately, when the going gets tough, when we have crazy races, whether it's this year at Baku or it's Turkey last year, we generally don't see Bottas up there. And I think that in a tight fight like this, Bottas might not be enough. Mercedes might need the combination of Russell and Hamilton rather than Hamilton and Bottas. For the past 4 seasons, I think that Valtteri has been a good enough driver for Mercedes because, generally speaking, they've had a good enough car that they don't really need Valtteri to do much except just finish behind Hamilton. But going forward, he has to start fighting and beating Checo Perez. And if he can't beat Perez this season and Red Bull do in the Constructors, which I personally think that Red Bull will win it, then Mercedes really are going to have to make a choice. And I think the logical option is to give George Russell the seat going forward. Now, I understand some of you might think that Valtteri is a bit unfortunate, and to some degree he is. Fighting Lewis Hamilton is a very, very difficult thing, and there's a reason that most drivers would lose against Hamilton 1v1 in the same car. But with that said, he's had the best car in F1 for about 5 years now, and he's never even come close to the championship. It's only round 7, and he's already 70 points behind Hamilton. And again, he has been unlucky. Monaco is a great example of that. But he's also, in many occasions, just not been good enough. And we all know in our heart of hearts, even if you root for Bottas, even if, like me, you find Bottas a likable person who you want to do well, or at the very least, who you feel sorry for, we all know in our heart of hearts, Valtteri isn't winning any championship. And that's why I think Mercedes have to really move forward. Hamilton won't be at Mercedes forever. Hamilton at some point, whether it's next year or the year after or in 3 years, but at some point he will retire. And Mercedes, I think, know that Bottas is not the person to lead Mercedes forward for the next 3-4 years and try to lead them into championships on his own. He is a good secondary driver, but ultimately, George Russell, that man there, is their future. And I think it's the right thing to do. Now, I think it's worth also mentioning that George Russell is not without his question marks, because in a Williams, he's yet to score a point. Now, I hear what you're saying. It's not necessarily that... Okay, the Williams, of course, is not necessarily a car which should get points. In fact, for the past 2 years, it's been arguably the worst car on the grid along with Haas. But with that said, there have been chances that Russell has had at Imola last year, among others, to get points. I don't bring this up to bring Russell down as a driver, but I bring this up to put things into context and to say, look, Russell is a great driver who I think in a Mercedes over a season would probably do a slightly better job than Valtteri Bottas. But for his first year, guys, we will have to give him time because the jump from fighting for P19 in a Williams or fighting for Q2 in a Williams is very different. There's a big jump from going to that to fighting for race wins week in, week out. I don't doubt that Russell can do that, and we saw last year at Sake that he can fight for those positions. But I think, guys, we have seen Russell, even at Imola this year, throw away good results for Williams. And of course, in the Mercedes, he'll have a chance every weekend to score a win, whereas in a Williams, he has one chance a season to score a point. But the fact remains, Valtteri Bottas and George Russell are, I don't think, are separated by that much at the moment. I think that currently the better driver is, of course, Russell, but I think that Russell will need at least 1 or 2 years to really catch up to Lewis. I don't think that we can expect him to completely shock everybody in his first year at Mercedes. I think it will take a bit more time than that, but I think ultimately the right choice for Mercedes is to sign George Russell. If you've got this far to the video, thank you all so much. This is my second video in a row, and I think that I've made some improvements already. But if you have any ideas or suggestions, then please do comment down below. I'll be going live later today, so please do join me for that. But thank you so much for watching, and until then, I'll see you guys next time. Take care.